There's no doubt about the enthusiasm the average British car owner has in motoring. In many countries, they'd call it a passion. Each year, he attends road and track races, like this Silverstone event, by the millions. He joins motor clubs and spends a large slice of his income on the cost and maintenance of his personal car. Each week, a good deal of money is spent on motoring journals to fit his particular interests. And there's no doubt that cars are one of his chief hobbies. And yet, a lot of the events in his motor world have gone a bit beyond him in sheer complexity. The speeds and safety of his own car are the results of contest proving. And to engineers and car manufacturers, the results are important. But what about Mr. A, the so-called average motorist, the chap crowded against the rail? Does he get more than a thrill? He's fascinated by racing. You couldn't keep him away from it. But since things have become so tricky, there isn't much he can learn anymore that can be applied to his own car and his own driving. To Mr. A, what counts is reliable performance plus economy. He feeds his car oil and petrol and spends money on its ills. Rightly, he wants good power, high mileage, and a safe ride for himself and his family. During the last weekend in August '57, 40 cars left Ascot with the same idea in mind. The Mobil Gas Economy Run, an FIA international event, originated back in 1936 to demonstrate that by skillful driving, Mr. A could get more miles for the same price. Most makes of car manufactured in the world compete annually, either here or overseas. This year's competition really began the night before the start with the impounding and scrutiny of the competitors' cars. In theory, the economy run is simple. In practice, it's fairly complicated. Supervised by RAC stewards, scrutineers check that every car is a standard production model and each part is verified. Lubrication must be standard too, so they drain and refill. The engine gets mobiloil special, of course. The cars are then precisely leveled and the petrol sucked out. This leveling makes it possible to return to the same datum line at the end of the run and allows accurate measurements of the petrol used, to the last spoonful. Production models are driven over a set route in a set time, and the car using the least petrol wins. However, if it were entirely a matter of petrol, the small cars would always win. The results are therefore computed on a ton-mile formula, and the contest is divided into 4 classes of engine capacity. Next morning, the drivers and the navigators were introduced to the observers who would ride with them and given back their cars, now richer by a number of official seals. The route they were to follow looped 1,000 miles up through the lakes and moors of the north of England, and it would be the afternoon of the 3rd day before their return to Ascot. Basically, economy driving is a matter of not applying brakes at short notice like this fellow, but of coming to gentle idling stops. That and treating the accelerator like a slightly cracked egg. This rubber-burning chap in the dark car, for example, is using twice the petrol needed, and the odds are they'll both meet at the next traffic lights. These rules are easy enough to remember on a holiday tour, but on the economy run, the route is controlled by time checks. If the competitor was not in the right place at the right time, his mileage figure was cut appropriately by the judges. This meant he made up time on the dual carriageways, but not too much, merely enough to compensate for what he thought he might lose going through the next town. The route was designed to reproduce the conditions Mr. A would encounter in a fortnight of normal holiday driving, and the 30-mile-an-hour average demanded of the contestants saw that they didn't creep along to save petrol or refrain from the normal habit of overtaking. Acceleration is a luxury, though. In an economy run, you can lose by the amount of petrol in a cigarette lighter. Well before lunch of the first day, the route began winding off into the narrow country lanes, the kind of up and down roads that were to occupy them for most of the run. An altitude chart of the first day's run varied between 50 and 1,700 feet, with the hardest climbs and descents in darkness. The cars were refueled along the route, but everyone had to use the same fuel, Mobil gas special. The lunchtime refueling stop near Chelford in Cheshire was the first since Ascot. At all points along the route, marshals of the Hanson Barks Motor Club, who organised the event, supervised the refueling and sent accurate records back to headquarters at Ascot. One of the most interesting stretches that lay ahead of them that first day was in the Lake District at the Hard Knot Pass. The motor club officials who laid out the route found you could take the 1 in 3 incline without effort in certain vehicles. Certainly this hill, plus the 2 similar ones that followed, would well represent all the low-gear climbing Mr. A would find in a month's holiday. On this sort of climb, even the most skillful drivers would be thinking more about making the top on time than saving petrol. Only the most instinctive drivers, the winners, would come off well. But what about coming down, you say? Unfortunately, coasting, turning off the engine or disengaging the clutch with the car in motion meant instant disqualification, and the impartial observer was in each car to see this rule enforced. By dusk, the cars had reached the first of the hills leading into the mountains of the Lake District. From this point on, for the next 6 hours, things got so hot out in front that you could have fried eggs on the bonnets. By the time the run arrived at the Hard Knot, even the starlight had failed. The only thing competitors could be absolutely sure of was that they were going upwards. A sign at the top of the next peak summed up the downgrade very nicely. At about 3 in the morning, cars pulled into the Palace Hotel in Buxton, 498.4 miles from Ascot. Some 4 or 5 hours later, it was the next morning and time to get underway again. This was a loop up through the Yorkshire moors to the coast and back through industrial areas to Buxton, a mere 262 miles. The first stage took them through Wynot's Pass in a leisurely drive to York for lunch and refueling. There were few breakdowns on the whole run, but when they did occur, like this actual case of a fuel line coming unstuck, the observers handed reports back to the judges for their decisions. After lunch in York, the route began to get more interesting. Tanked up on both food and petrol, they headed north towards the moors under a solid overcast that was to keep the drivers turning their wipers on and off all afternoon. Not all of the water was coming from above either. Some of the roads selected by the route planners were found to be slightly rugged, and an excellent answer to the problem of condensing a fortnight's driving conditions into 3 days. Watched by the happy, laughing Welkeeter, the run passed through Scarborough. As the gentleman said, "It's to come earlier. It were a reet grand day yesterday." It could have been a good test, for the competitors must obey all traffic and road laws, even the courtesy type, or risk a report from their observer. From there, it was an easy run to the refuel and route check at Conisborough, outside Sheffield. This year saw a fairly heavy European entry, Dutch, Swedish and French. This may have been caused by last year's French economy run having been won by a Briton. It's hard to tell. In any case, it gave the contest a decidedly international flavour. The next hour found the run sorting away through the general congestion of Sheffield and its suburbs. Buxton and the evening's festivities were only a few miles off, however, and at this point it seemed the route planner had relaxed and given them an easy end to a pleasant afternoon. Then, not far out of the city, they began to see that they were being led into a stretch of twists and turns and narrow bends. If you have that kind of stomach, it's great for working up an appetite. If not, hard luck. At a civic reception held that night at the Palace Hotel in Buxton, His Grace the Duke of Devonshire and competitors were received by the chairman of Mobil Oil Company Limited and the mayor of Buxton. It was the first chance to swap stories and honestly relax in 2 days. They had plenty to talk about, and it went on over the banquet. And who ever heard of staying in a spa and not taking the waters? The next morning, however, it was back to business with an altogether new attitude. A little calculation by most of the contestants made it clear that the prizes were still on the road. The performance on the day's run back to Ascot could still add up to success or failure. Ascot was, however, exactly 180.4 miles away. There were still plenty of opportunities for everyone to make mistakes. One group of unsung heroes in the run were the observers. The drivers and navigators took turns at the wheel and were only allowed to drive 200 miles at a stretch by rule. The observers, however, had no such relief. Theirs was but to sit and watch, report infringements, and generally bounce about in the back seat with the luggage and the boiled sweets. Things went fairly smoothly on the return trip, except around milking time. By this time, even a headwind could alter the results. This may sound pedantic, but after all, how far can you go in this search for economy? By now, the checkpoint refuel routine was as familiar to the contestants as driving. It has been said that if the average motorist concentrated on economy driving, he would earn himself several weeks free motoring every year. Back at Ascot, the drivers pulled in, rolled up to the finish line, and quickly shut off their engines. The run was over for another year. All that remained now was to check and double-check the figures. The RAC scrutineers and the team of club mechanics took over the cars at the finish. They were pushed back to the impound and were given the same detailed inspection they received at the beginning. Each seal was examined, the car was leveled, and the petrol drained and credited to the contestant. Even the fumes were condensed and measured. But yes, Mr. A, what's all this to him? Well, he's interested. From the published results, he gets a good idea of the honest road performance of car models. It helps him decide which car on the market is best suited to his means. As well, it's the sort of contest he can hold every day with himself, and if he wins, the prize is already in his pocket. It's safe driving, economy driving. For the passengers, it's a comfortable ride, and it's one way of making the miles between the petrol pumps a bit longer.